Hi, it's Mike Stevenson here. So in the video today, we want to have a little bit of a look at an approach I've been playing around with about developing logic apps with Terraform. And, well, I say Terraform in a combination of the Azure portal. So one of the problems that we have with consumption logic apps or ICE logic apps is you've got the problem that if you develop in Visual Studio, the you can have some performance challenges as your logic apps get more complicated, and it can become a bit of a pain. And then the reverse is that there's an ARM client tool that we were using for a while, but the problem is it creates ARM templates that are really highly parameterized, so you end up having to kind of manage more parameters than would be ideal. So ideally with logic apps, I think it tends to get to be more effective developing it if you've got like a sort of small to medium sized number of parameters that you have to configure per environment. And I think that ARM client tool used to end up with way too many. It kind of, the problem with logic apps is sometimes it's a little bit awkward to get that right balance, and we just ended up parameterizing so many things that it made the DevOps process a real pain. And what tends to happen, I think, with logic apps is once you kind of get up and running, you often find that a lot of your parameters are fairly fixed, where they're the same for all logic apps. So if you can just find a good balance of having the right number of parameters to worry about, not overcomplicating it. And the approach that we've got with Terraform, where sort of we're developing the logic apps in the portal, downloading them, and then we're using Terraform, and there's a few other things we're doing for redeployments. That's kind of what I want to talk about today. So we've got a couple of logic apps here, and they're pretty simple. They don't really do a lot of stuff. So if we have a quick look, you can see this one. It receives a request in HTTP. I'm calling an API management. I'm calling a SQL connector. I'm calling a function, a helper logic app, and a service bus. So I wanted to kind of get a range of some of the common things that people are likely to be doing. The second logic app is really just a pretty vanilla one where it just returns a response. So that's the helper one that the parent logic app calls. So if you imagine at this point, I'm developing my logic apps in the portal. I've got a few parameters in this one I'll just show. So I've got things like the queue name I'm passing as a parameter for calling telling it which queue I'm using. But I do have a couple of API connections, sorry, not on the function, on the SQL connector and on the service bus connector. So we're going to have a look in this video at how to set those up as well. So what I'm doing over here in VS Code, I've got my folder, and I've got a bunch of Terraform stuff in here. Now, just to keep it simple, there's two types of objects you have in Terraform. You've got data objects, which is a pre-existing object that you want to reference, so you can use it as a pointer to get a property. So, for example, here I've got my API management, so that lives in its own resource group. So I've got a data object that tells me the resource group that APIM belongs to. I've got my APIM instance, so from that object I could reference its gateway URL, for example. And here's an API, my utility helper API that I've got here, and I can actually point to that API to get its path or something like that. So that's what the data objects are about. You can see I've got one for functions here, so I've got some helper functions, I've got a key vault, I've got a service bus. Now, when I come down to the logic apps down here, so I've got my logic app resourcing. See the res dot files, they're the ones where I'm defining resources that I want to manage in this Terraform solution. So the first type of file is data dot, which is something pre-existing I want to reference. Res dot is really resource that I'm going to manage. Now here I've got a definition for a logic app. So at the top I've defined a file. So this file is going to have my my workflow.json in it, which we'll come on to in a minute. This bit I'll come back to in a second as well, but really the bit I'm looking at for now is this resource. So we're using the azure API resource here, and I'm going to define the demo1 logic app in this file, and then this other file here's the demo2 one. And what I'm doing is I'm going to say, right, here's the type for the azure API. So it's a workflow. I'm going to give it a name, a location, and then the parent it lives in is going to be the resource script the logic apps will deploy to. I'm also going to create, use the depends on. So in this logic app, when I deploy it, I'm going to reference the second logic app. So I'm going to create them a dependency order so that it does logic app 2 before logic app 1. And then also I've got a function that I'm going to show in a second video. So I've got a couple of other dependencies that I'm just creating here as well. Now, when I create my logic app here, I'm going to create a user assigned identity for that logic app, and I'm going to assign it so that we can use that on the APIM call, for example. And then I'm going to set some tags here. So I've got this definition of some default tags, which we'll look at later. And I'm going to also assign a deployment time. So this will basically configure your tags. Now, the key bit for Terraform is the body. So I'm going to basically here I'm going to read the JSON file for this. The definition gets set from the JSON file from the logic app. I'm going to read that in, but I'm going to inject some parameters into it, which we'll have a look at in a minute when I read it in. And then the final bit is the parameter values at deployment time. So this is a bit like when you set values in your ARM template. I need to set these parameters, things like the queue name, and then the values for the connections. So you can see here I've got my custom property where I'm saying here's the queue name where I'm pointing to a service bus queue that I'm going to create, and I'm going to pass its name in. So we'll have a look in the second video about creating this service bus queue, but just know that for the minute I'm passing the name of it in. And then I've got my connections here where I'm passing things like the SQL connection and the service bus connection. I can specify things like the ID, the name of that connection. So I'm gonna actually in the second video as well, we'll have a look at how we create those connection resources. And for the minute, I want to just focus on this download of the logic app and redeploy. So in the second video, we'll look at how we set up these API connections with Terraform. But here, when we deploy it, we're just passing the values in when the logic app deploys. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is for them logic apps we've got in the portal, I've got this PowerShell script up here called logic apps download. So what I'm going to do is I've got my two logic apps. I'm going to provide the name, the output file that I want, and then the resource script that that logic app belongs to. So I can run this script. If we just drag it in down here, and what it'll do is it'll go to Azure and it'll get the workflow JSON. So we'll see that running through there. So it's outputted both those files. So it's going to go to Azure and it's going to get the logic app definition, which you'll see here. So we have it as a string, and then here I'm just going to do some basic replaces. So I'm going to look for the resource group. So usually you would have this string would represent the resource group, and I'm just going to put a parameter in here so I can, if you think of things like DevOps when we do these configure files, I can inject values into that file. Here I'm going to replace the subscription ID. I'm going to replace, so I'll have some common things that most of my logic apps will have in. So I'm going to replace my APIM resource group, my function resource group, the name of my APIM. So that if you're in the dev environment, this might be APIM-dev. Put a parameter in and then you deploy it elsewhere. It's just going to be APIM, system test UAT or whatever. And then really this just then outputs those values, outputs this JSON file, and I end up with this file down here. So the difference is it's not the ARM template, it's just workflow.json that came from the logic app. So it's a bit like in the portal, if I just go over here and I get the code view, it's really this, but all I'm doing is I'm I'm looking for values like that, and I'm going to just parameterize them. So it's a nice, easy way to do it. Now, what I'm doing next is when I run my Terraform, up here you'll see we've got to read this file, and I want to inject parameters into it, which I can do with a Terraform template file object. So I've got my data points to the file, which is the local file provider. I have my template file, and this one really what you're doing is you're passing the content from this object up here, which points to the file itself. And this one basically lets you, the vars property lets you provide replacements. So here, if I find my my value for the resource group or my value for the APIM instance, I can just pass a value. So here what I'm doing is I'm saying, oh, the API management's resource group, I've got that up here as this data object, so I can just pass whatever its name is, my Terraform would know. And here I've got the name of my APIM instance and my functions. So I can just do all the replaces for the common sort of find replace values within my logic app as I read the template file. And that means down here, when I specify the actual parameters I want in the logic app, it's really simple because there's, they're just the same values I had in the portal. I don't need to worry about all the ARM parameters and stuff. And that's really it for deploying the logic app. So when I run my Terraform here, so if I run my Terraform apply, so we'll just give that a second to run. So I know I'm going to make a few changes here. So I'm going to update my function app. I'm going to update each of the logic apps because I'm deliberately injecting a new deployment time into the tags, so it'll update them. You can see here I'm also updating the deployment tag on my API connectors, which we'll look at in the next video. And so that'll go and update a few of those resources if I say yes to go and make those changes. You can see it's just doing those updates there now. There we go. So that's those changes applied. So I can now go back to the portal, and the idea would be I could go and make excuse me, make some changes here in the portal. Say I add a few more shapes, and then I would just run my PowerShell script, which would download the updated JSON to that that JSON workflow file here. Sorry if I open the right VS Code. So it would update this file here, and then I can deploy it again from VS Code, and then I could check it in and use a pipeline to deploy it to other environments. And I feel like that would be quite an easy way to avoid having to deal with all the challenges of Visual Studio and some of the over complex parameters in the ARM client tool that we've also used for a while. Now, you could also probably do the same thing with Bicep. If you prefer to use Bicep, I'm just used to using Terraform, which is easy enough for me. But the key thing is that PowerShell script download your workflow, and then you're doing that redeployment. You're just injecting some parameters in. Now, in the next video, I'm going to have a look at some of these other Terraform files. And what I want to do is, one of the things I quite like about this approach is being able to create an Azure Integration Services solution rather than just a logic app solution, and I'll show how we'll do other things with this. So thanks for listening. Catch the next video.